continue this morning in our brief study in our devotion using the Gospel of Luke. And of course, today the text that we're looking at is from verse 41 to verse 51.
Not 52, huh?
No, let me explain. Verse 52 actually has an impact also as part of this passage now. But the text actually, the account that we are looking at actually is from verse 41 to verse 51. It actually records a very simple incident that happened in the life of Jesus when he was 12 years old. It was like a family event that took place in Jerusalem. And so Luke records this event taking place and some words that Jesus spoke and some circumstances surrounding this event. But to understand Luke's intention and the flow of his writing, we need to consider the verse before it and the verse at the end of 51, verse 52. Because verse 40 there, we saw last time we looked at the passage, right? How Jesus grew strong, became strong, and he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him, right? That verse alone actually carries a passage of time of 12 years. Yes. Meaning within that 12 years, he became physically strong, he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And so then Luke captures this incident within this bracket of Jesus growing in wisdom, in physical and intellect and wisdom of God and the grace of God. And the verse in verse 52 carries again just one verse, the passage of 18 years. Because here in this account, he's 12 years old, right?
Oh, yeah.
But at the end of 52, when he appears again, he's already 30 years old at least. And so there's another passage of 18 years. And so within these 30 years actually, Luke captures this account, and incidentally, it records the only time that Jesus said anything prior to his public ministry. And so Luke has a very special intention for including this incident. And it happened at a time when Jesus was 12 years old. And it also happened at the festival of the Passover. I think Luke intentionally put all these things together and record this incident because he's got something so important that I think we can think about this morning. Because the age 12 is actually 1 year before a Jewish child becomes an adult. What has developed over time now is what they call the bar mitzvah. Is you become a son of the law. And so once you reach 13, you actually become responsible, you become accountable to obeying the commands of God. You're not so much under your parents' cover anymore. You have to stand before God and you're accountable to the obedience of God's law. And so here, before Jesus turned 13, of course, we are told, right, that he grew in wisdom, he grew physically, he grew in the grace of God. And then just before he reaches 13, the parents bring him to the Passover festival. And the Passover, of course, you all know, right, it's just one of the three major feasts that is celebrated in Jerusalem. There's a Passover, that is 1 day, and then there are 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so the whole festival actually is 8 days. And then after that, after 50 days, there's also the Feast of Pentecost. And that is when they celebrate the first fruits of the harvest. And then there's another feast called the Feast of the Tabernacle, when the people of God remember their journey through the wilderness, how they had to live in tents and all that, and be totally dependent on God. And so these are the three major festivals. But Luke records this incident of the Passover when Jesus was 12, just before he turned 13, I think to give, the understanding of the context in which this event was taking place. Imagine before what is recorded by Luke, Jesus would have been with the parents in Jerusalem. And at that point in time, right, there would have been hundreds of thousands of people milling around, in the city and then also in the temple area. And then for any family to have come for the Passover, they would have had to buy a sacrificial lamb and then from the temple. And then apparently, I also read, and I'm sure some of you may be aware, at this time, right, there are like hundreds of thousands of lambs that are being slaughtered. Sometimes we see, in the festival in the Muslim community, right? Some are. And so it is the same thing. And so there is the place towards the back of the temple, where the animals are slaughtered and the priests are all engaged in doing that work. And the whole place is just bloody. And the blood of the animals are just flowing, and all that. And so Jesus, imagine, right, would have seen all these things and understood actually also the meaning of the Passover lamb being sacrificed for the atonement of the sins of the people. And he's 12 years old, going on 13, being accountable to God already. And having grown in wisdom, he would have fully comprehended that actually this is just a shadow of his own life to come. I'm just saying all this so that we have a feel of, what was in the Lord's mind, and perhaps explain why also he stayed behind in Jerusalem after the parents left the temple on the way home, and why he was engaged with the teachers there and asking them questions now. And so this was probably, many of the things that was, in his mind as he kind of dialogue actually with the teachers there. And so the incident itself actually is quite simple to understand. The parents had come to the temple to offer sacrifice of the Passover, and then on that day, of course, they would have taken the lamb back to their home, whether it was a friend's home or whether it was a rented place, and then they would have eaten the lamb with the Lord, in the family. And I think, in Jewish tradition, right, and the Passover meal, right, the eldest son would always ask the father, why is this night different from any other night of the year? And then the father, within the family context, would explain, how the Passover was instituted by God, how God had passed over the household of Israel, and then all the firstborns were saved. Whereas the firstborn, whether animal or children, in all the Egyptian households, all died. And this was God's way of delivering his people from slavery so that they can enter into God's promise of a land flowing with milk and honey. And so you can imagine, right, even at the evening when this meal was celebrated, again this whole picture would have become very clear in the Lord's mind, even though he was just 12 years old. And then after they had stayed for the whole duration of the festival, and I read also that actually this indicates that the family stayed there for the whole 8 days. Not everybody stayed for 8 days, but because Joseph and Mary were, I think we read earlier passage also, they were really devout. And then they stayed, for their own devotion to God, the full 8 days. And then, of course, they left the temple on the way home. And they had traveled a whole day's journey on the way back to Nazareth before they wanted to settle for the night. And I guess that is when they, the families will come together. Because in the caravan, as they travel, right, the entourage, right, what they will do is they will have the children move ahead first, so that they will be traveling at the pace that the children can manage. And then behind the children would be the wives and the mothers, and then the men would be behind. And so while they were on the move, they didn't know, that Jesus was not with them, that he had stayed back in Jerusalem. But when they were about to settle for the night, that is when families will gather their members together, and then they discovered that the Lord was not there. And so then, they were anxious, and so they made their way back. They have traveled 1 day's journey, and they make another day to travel back, the same route where they had traveled, right, to go back to Jerusalem. And they probably spent another day looking for Jesus all the way back. And then when they were in the city, going to every place that they had been to while they were in the city. And then finally they found themselves in the temple, and then that is where they saw Jesus. And they saw him in the temple courts, sitting amidst the teachers, listening, not teaching, listening, because he was 12 years old, and then also asking them questions. And these questions that Jesus asked, even though he was 12 years old, must have been very penetrating questions, such that the teachers themselves also then sought clarification from him. Because we are told in the description there, right, that they were amazed at his answers. And so you can imagine that there was a dialogue going on like that, and the people who heard Jesus were amazed at his, at his answers to the questions that were being, asked for, to clarify the things that he was asking about now. And so into that scene, then the parents came. And I think the idea here is Luke describes what was happening there first, before describing the parents finding him. And I think you can imagine that Mary probably also was, as she made her way to where Jesus was, probably took in everything that was happening. Jesus dialoguing with the teachers, and the wisdom that he displayed, and how the people were amazed. Yet in spite of that, she did not take the role of the person who understands the place that Jesus would play in the unfolding of God's salvation plan. Instead, she played the role of a mother. who is very anxious. And then she came to the 12-year-old boy and said, "Why do you treat us in this way? Do you not know that your father and I have anxiously been looking for you?" To which then Jesus replied. And I think Luke wants us to see Jesus reply and then think a little bit more deeply about it. Jesus' reply was what? To the mother, "Why were you seeking for me? Did you not know that I have to be in my Father's house?" Now Luke records this for us, I think, firstly to show something that is very important. To definitely have the readers understand Jesus' understanding of his own identity. Luke from chapter 1 to now has already told us the testimony of different people, of Zacharias and Elizabeth, to the identity of the baby Jesus that is going to be born, that he will be a horn of salvation that God would raise in the house of David. That's what Zacharias understood. And then the angel also, pronounced the coming of the Messiah. And Mary herself also was told by the angel. And then you have the testimony of Simeon and Anna. And so Luke records all these different testimonies of different people, kind of, attesting to the identity of this baby who is to come, how he is the Messiah that God has prepared, and all that. But here now Luke tells us the testimony of Jesus himself. Even though he was 12 years old, we have to understand that he has grown, he was filled with wisdom. And then he's about on the brink of adulthood. And Jesus is very clear about his own identity, that he is the Son of God. Because he says, "I am in my Father's house." Calling the God of Israel, the God who is worshipped by the nation, in this temple that has been dedicated to him, to God, Jesus said, "This is my Father's house." Now the Israelites have always understood that God is the creator. And so there is a sense that God is the Father of the universe, being the creator. There's also the understanding, that God is the father of the nation of Israel, because God called Abraham and then God raised, the descendants of Abraham after him. But there is, at this point in time, no inkling at all that anybody would ever dare say that God is my personal father. There's no evidence of that at all in the Jewish culture. But here Jesus is proclaiming such a personal relationship with God. I have to be in my Father's house. And so he's making this statement that Luke records for us to show that Jesus truly understood his own identity, that he is God's Son. He's the Son of God. And then he is very clear about what he has come to do. And I think if you especially read the Gospel of John, right, many times it is mentioned, Jesus said, "I only do what the Father has called me to do. I only do what I've seen the Father do. And the Father is working all the time, so I too must be working." And so Jesus is saying, "I only obey the commands of my Father." And so here Jesus proclaimed very clearly that he is God's Son, and he has come only to be about the Father's business. In some other translation, it's not translated, "I have to be in my Father's house." I have to be about the Father's business. And some other translation put it like that. And so it carries the same idea. God is my Father, and I've come only to carry out his will, to do the things that he has called me to do. And so here Luke would have us see that Jesus truly is very clear about who he is and why he has come. And so then, after Jesus said this, Luke records for us about the parents. After they heard him say this, Luke says, "But they did not understand what he meant." Now, it is unusual, right? Because Mary has had the angel, proclaimed to her. And then she knows that she's a virgin. And she knows that this is a child that God has kind of, allowed her womb to kind of, bear to fruition now. And so she knows that it's a miraculous birth because she's a virgin, right? And so, but yet, after having all the preparation, and after 12 years of living with this child, who throughout the 12 years would have been completely, perfectly obedient and without sin, even though he would have been fully tempted even as a growing up child, but he had never sinned. And the mother could see that for herself, right? And knowing that, here is God's preparation, for the salvation of the world. Yet when she heard Jesus said this, Luke tells us that she did not understand what he meant. And I think here there are two things that I believe that Mary, even though with all the preparation, as in her motherhood, right, and having lived with this child for 12 years, right, yet she could not understand. Now here Jesus was obviously proclaiming that he is God's son. And the son here is not like, generational, your offspring, your next generation. It is not. The Son of God is almost like what? Is like you have the same nature with God. In essence, you are equal with God. And so to say God's son is to say that you are the second person of the Godhead, the second person of the Trinity. It is actually saying that you are God, the second Godhead, And so when Jesus made a very clear statement, right, it is to make, that proclaim the truth, right, that he is actually like God. He's God, right? And Mary could not understand the full implication of the statement. Even though she had lived with this person, even though she had angelic visitation, even though she had some knowledge that other people did not have, yet she failed to understand the sovereignty of the God that is standing before her. And I want to just take this reaction of Mary to kind of have us think a little bit deeper, because we have the same problem. Now Mary, first of all, failed to see that God is sovereign over all earthly relationship, no matter how close the relationships may be. And in this case, it's a relationship of what? Of a mother and a child, or a father and a child. But yet the sovereignty of God must override even the closest relationship on earth. And I think, for us, Mary failed to see that. And then often also, I think we struggle, handling the sovereignty of God over our allegiance to the other relationships that we have in this world. As a parent, sometimes children become more important to us even than God. Or sometimes as children, if we are totally dependent on our parents, sometimes our parents become even more important to us than God. Or sometimes in our social interaction, right, there are some people of influence to whom we look up to and we depend on, sometimes even to the exclusion of the sovereignty of God. And I think even though Mary, having understood, having, been told by the angel, and having lived with this child for 12 years, yet she had a problem understanding the person before her who proclaimed that he is God, equal with God. She could not understand the sovereignty that this person must have over her life. And eventually, of course, her understanding grew. And so when Luke writes, right, that she treasured these things secretly in her heart, I think and this is the third time that Luke says it.
Yeah.
It's the third time. I think it's a collection of all the experiences that Mary had. And after time had passed, when she had began to understand, then she understood actually, for example, in this incident, right, what she actually missed. And so, she tells Luke, probably when, she gave the eyewitness account to Luke, right, how when this thing happened, she didn't understand, but slowly she understood that Jesus is not just her son. Jesus is more than a son. Jesus is her God, her Lord, her Savior. You know what I mean? And so here, Mary had a prompt understanding the sovereignty that God exercises over all earthly relationship. And I think we need to think maybe a little bit more deeply about the sovereignty of God in our life also. Now, secondly, also, I think the sovereignty question here has to do with understanding the sovereignty of God over our own will, or our own desires, or our own ambition, or our own feelings. You see, Mary here, in her interaction with Jesus, she was the mother. She came to Jesus and said, "Why are you doing these things to us? Meaning to tell him, do you not know, that you do this, you stay behind, you didn't tell us, you cause us so much suffering, and why are you causing us to suffer? And so Mary was more concerned about her own feelings and grievances than she is about recognizing the sovereignty of the person that was standing in front of her and talking to her. And I think here we also have the same issue. We can talk about the sovereignty of God. Theologically, we can say God is sovereign, right? Everything, God is in control. Nothing happens in this world outside of God's control. We can say that, and it sounds like, we have the right theological framework to understand God. But is God truly sovereign over our will? If sometimes you want to do something, but you know that perhaps this is not something that God has called you to do, but sometimes we kind of push ahead because why? We set the sovereignty of God aside. I am the sovereign one. I decide what I want to do. And so here Mary's motherly, concern overrode her recognition of the sovereignty of the one who was standing before her. And I think here also it requires us to think, a little bit deeper about what it means to follow after the Lord who is and must be sovereign over everything in our life. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight, but we must recognize what sovereignty of God means in each of our lives, and then deal with it, and surrender progressively as we mature, in our trust in Him. And then also, finally, I think we are told, right, that Jesus then, after this incident, He went back to Nazareth with the family and was obedient to them. And that actually covers another 18 years of His life. When you think about it, it is really amazing. Here, when He was 12 years old already, He knew who He was. He was God, right? And then when He interacted even with the teachers of Israel, I'm sure He understood, the things of God much, much deeper than the teachers could. But yet He had to restrain Himself in a certain sense, not kind of, pushing them aside and to show how much He knows, right? And so here also, knowing that He's a sovereign God, even over His parents, and then they ought to understand that He's sovereign over them, yet He subjected Himself to the parents' guidance and teachings and household rules and whatever, in total obedience. And I think here is something quite amazing because, I think the Bible tells us, right, that He would fulfill all righteousness. And so He was sinless throughout His growing up years, even before He came out to minister, right? And yet, knowing that He's fully God, He became obedient even to His earthly parents. And I think here it describes a certain principle of growth that I think, is worthwhile to think a little bit more deeply about. Sometimes we Christians like to, imagine that if only we can meet a certain very spiritual man, and then he can, pray for us, or we kind of think of, spiritual growth as something that we would like to happen overnight. Cannot. It doesn't happen like that, right? It takes years of preparation. It takes years of obedience before we come to the point when God says, yes, this person is ready to carry out the things that I want him to do for me. And so Jesus was in preparation for whole 30 years. And so there is no overnight, success story, so to speak. And so God gives us time for us to mature to the point when He then can truly use us for His purposes. And I think finally Luke also in this passage wants us to see not only the divinity, the deity of Christ, but also to understand that He's fully human. Right? He also, was curious to learn. He went to the temple to listen, and then He grew up, over the years. And so He was 100% man. But yet He was also 100% God. Meaning even at 12, He understood who He was. That He's God's Son who has come to carry out God's plans, for the world in salvation. And so I think Luke, points out to us the two questions of God's sovereignty. That He is sovereign over all earthly relationships. He's also sovereign over our personal will and ambition. And so while we say that God is sovereign, I think we still, have a whole life to put in place the sovereignty of God over our own personal will and ambition. And so I think Luke wants us to see some of these things even more clearly as he brings forth the divinity of Christ, as Jesus himself testifies. Because I think over time in church history we also know, right, that there are some false idea, right, that Jesus never said that he was the Messiah. He never said that he himself was the Messiah. That it was in some sense because of the messianic expectation of the Jewish population at the time, and then he was kind of put into that position where then he said, I must live up to people's expectation. And it was a terrible idea. Why? Because it was a total failure, right? He didn't bring in the Davidic kingdom. Instead, he was crucified and he died, right? And so it was a misconceived, badly misunderstood idea. Or there were some people who said that, he lived until he was 30 years old, and then when he was 30, somehow the Spirit of God came upon him, for him to do the things that he was able to do. And that is not true. Luke would clarify for us, when he was just 12 years old, just on the brink of adulthood, he already understood who he was. Or just as Luke had recorded all the other people, all the other witnesses, who had proclaimed him to really be the child, the God, the horn of salvation that God had prepared. And so I think it provides us with a clearer understanding of who Christ is, even before we meet him in public ministry. Yeah, amen.
Okay.